It's the fat show.
Today's episode is your guide to logical reasoning, and I invite you to think with me. When I say that man has been staring at me, what comes to your mind? Do you think I'm overreacting? Being sensitive? Now, let me say it differently. That man has been sitting there for hours, barely glancing at the book he's holding. Instead, he won't take his eyes off of me. Suddenly, it feels convincing, right? It feels true. But here's the thing. Both sentences are saying the exact same thing. The first one sounds emotional, the second one sounds like a logical conclusion. And because it sounds logical, you trust it. Because we associate logic with truth. If it makes sense, it must be real. But logic does not equal truth. It's simply a tool to present our thoughts and ideas, a tool anyone can shape and twist in a way that feels solid. That's why understanding how logic works, how arguments are constructed, and why they feel believable is so important, especially in a world where anything can be made to make sense. A lot of people think emotion and logic are opposites, as if logic is objective and emotion is subjective. But that's not really how it works. Logic is built by us with our fears, belief, desire, and all the things we pretend don't influence us. So the real question becomes, how do you package your perspective so people actually listen? Because no matter how true what you're saying is, people won't hear it unless it sounds understandable. And what makes something sound understandable? A pattern. When we say something is logical, what we really mean is that the pattern is clear. The mind can follow it. And when the pattern is smooth enough, the whole thing starts to look like truth. Our brains love patterns. So when an argument fits neatly into a pattern, into a structure, our brain goes, yes, that makes sense. And if it doesn't, we dismiss it. We label it emotional or irrational, even when it may be accurate. To build a logical argument is simply to create a pattern of connected ideas that lead to your conclusion. A equals B, B equals C, so A equals C. This is how logic works. Before starting any argument or idea, you already have a destination in mind, a conclusion you want the audience to reach with you. That's your A equals C. But you can't start there. You can't throw your opinion at people. Hey, A equals C, you sound crazy. You need a foundation first, your A equals B, which is something your listener already agrees with. Take the earlier example, that man is staring at me. That's too raw. It's a feeling, not an argument. So you have to build structure. First statement, that man has been sitting there for hours. A neutral observation that everyone will agree with you on. Second statement is barely glancing at the book he's holding. Now you're mixing fact with a bit of interpretation. That's your breach. Then you move on to your thought statement, your conclusion. He won't take his eyes off of me. He's staring at me. This is your actual point. But because of the structure you've created, it doesn't feel baseless. It feels reasoned. Here's why this works. When we start with something logical, the brain automatically tries to complete the pattern. Just like when you read a word with missing letters and your brain just fills in the gaps. That's the secret behind sounding logical. You don't convince people by flooding them with facts or throwing your feelings at them. You guide their brain into completing a pattern that leads exactly where you want them to be. And that's where the problem begins. Because if something can sound right, even when it's wrong, how do you tell the difference? Have you ever listened to someone present an idea that made no sense? But they said it with so much logic that for a moment, even you couldn't argue against it. I had that moment recently while listening to a podcast. The guest said something I completely disagreed with, but the way she said it, the way she explained it, I couldn't find words to refute her. I had to search for holes that weren't immediately obvious in the pattern she's created. That's the nature of logic. We tend to assume that logic equals truth, that if something is logical, it must be right. It's like we've crowned logic as this neutral, reflective mirror of objective reality. But that's not true. Anything can be made to make sense. if you build the pattern correctly. And that's both fascinating and terrifying. So let's explore those quiet hidden flaws in logic that make something sound true even when it isn't. Take the first one, something I call motivated reasoning. Doomsday predictions, for example. There's always one every few years, someone claiming the world will end on a very specific date. I remember hearing about one that was supposed to happen September of this year. Obviously it didn't. We're still here. But when you listen to the people who believe it, you can see how they build their case. They quote Bible verses, refer to historical events, point to natural disasters, talk about the numbers 3, 7, 13, and somehow it all connects. You can literally see the puzzle forming, every piece fits. And that's what makes it so convincing, because once you've decided what to believe, that the world will end on a specific date, that a certain ethnicity or religion is a certain way, your mind starts working backwards to justify it. You start dragging facts, coincidences, theories into a neat little pattern that supports your conclusion. But when the prediction fails, instead of abandoning the idea, they come up with new explanations to keep it alive. The dates changed. Oh, that day was an exception. That person was an exception. Anything but admitting that they were wrong from the very beginning. Because at that point, it's not about facts anymore. It's now about identity, belonging, and emotional investment. Logic becomes a servant to belief. It's very similar to confirmation bias. You already have your endpoint, a clear conclusion, and now you're building the road that leads perfectly to it. It feels rational, but it's not about discovering the truth. It's about reinforcing what you already believe. It's built on your bias and sentiment and personal feeling, yet it's disguised as reason. And then there's another one, something a little more common. I once had a friend ask why I didn't smoke. I gave the simple reason: I don't like it. It starts off by saying, how do you know you don't like something when you haven't even tried it? Now, you can't argue with that logic. It's true. You do have to try certain things to know if you like them. That's how we find our interest, passion, even ourselves. But here's the thing, that logic, though true, does not apply here. Smoking isn't a hobby or an activity I need to do to find myself. It's a known vice. I do not need to test poison to know it's harmful. And this is one of the quieter flaws of logic: misapplied truth. A statement that is true on its own, but used in a context where it doesn't fit. And this is very common. Once you know it, you start seeing it everywhere around you. Recently, a Nigerian artist paused his concert because a fan in the front row was sleeping. He refused to continue the show unless the fan left, which they did, so he essentially chased her out of there. This caused a lot of backlash, so he released an apology where he defended his actions by comparing himself to a pilot removing a disruptive passenger and a teacher sending out a disruptive student. All these are true statements. Pilots can do that. Teachers can do that. But that truth does not belong in this context. A sleeping fan does not constitute a safety threat, and they're not disrupting anyone. This is the trick, using truth from one context to justify your actions, which is in a completely different context. It sounds logical, but the logic does not connect. But by comparing himself to institutions with formal authority, pilots, teacher, he borrows their authority and moral weight to justify his actions. That's why in any logical argument, you have to ask, do the truth being used actually belong here, or are they being dragged in from somewhere else to make the pattern look complete? The thing about logic is that it gives us structure, but it's not truth. It can be dressed up and rearranged to suit individual purpose and belief. Now, it's important to know that logic isn't always used to deceive. The person has thought it through. They've built it up and it makes sense to them. The real challenge is learning to recognize the flaws in a person's logic and not just accepting something as true. simply because it makes sense, and to pay attention to that feeling when something sounds perfectly right, but it still doesn't feel right. That's the moment to pause and to look closer.